Hello, everybody. So what I want to do is actually go through a number of things that you might find useful in terms of working with the FSG generator. And more important than that, just some things that you'll end up doing in terms of building your application with the mean stack or with the JavaScript stack. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new application, and I'm going to use the fsg generator, which I have already installed. So I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to call this nwind fsg, and I'll cd into it. Nwind fsg, and that was a typo, cd. Okay. Exists already, so okay. So now I'm in here. I've got an empty directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say fsg, and this is going to end up creating my project structure for me. Very quick command. If I look here, I'll see that I've got some folders. You notice I don't have a node modules folder. I'll create a node modules folder, npm install, and it'll go through the installation process for me. Let's take a little bit to install. While this is happening, in order to deploy this, we'll first get it to run, see that we're able to run it locally, and then we'll end up deploying it. But in order to deploy it, you're going to have an account that's set up on Heroku. Now, Heroku it's pretty easy to, obviously you could set up an account, you could have 5 free applications. Once you go over that number, you have to start paying for it, or at least I could give them a credit card. There's a couple of different ways that you could deploy to Heroku. I've been using the Heroku tool build, which is this tool that's fairly easy to use. You could download it, and what it basically allows you to do is to interact with Heroku. So you can create an application and you could deploy that application. You could also see, look at your logs for that application to see, what issues you've possibly run into in terms of deploying. So this is one thing that you're going to want to download. Although there's another way you can end up deploying. You can end up deploying straight from GitHub, so that every time you end up pushing to GitHub, you'll end up deploying. I'm not going to do that. In fact, I don't really even need to push my solution, my repo, which is going to be local. I don't even have to push it up to Heroku to do what I'm doing, although in a normal application, obviously, you would want to do that. So this is one tool that I'm going to use. The other thing that I'm going to use, and again, there might be easier ways to do this at this point, is that I have an account set up on MLab, and this allows me to set up a Mongo instance that I could end up running from, and that'll end up taking care of my database. So locally, I've got Mongo installed, but it's not installed by default on Heroku, and I'm going to use Mongo Lab for that to create a repository, although we're not going to need to do that until a little bit later on. So this is free as well, as long as you're not using huge databases. And if I go to Heroku, these are the apps that I have set up now. I actually ended up getting rid of something recently just so I could show you, have space on here for another repo that I'm going to be adding. Again, this is going to go through its installation process. And let's actually just pop this open and take a look at it. So one thing that we're going to end up running into when we deploy is we're going to see how different environments are set up, so that when we end up running locally, we're going to be using one type of environment, different environment variables. When we deploy to Heroku, we're going to see that there's going to be different values. And this is actually set up in the architecture of the application. Not that much we have to do with that. So if we take a look and pop that open, while this is installing, one of the things that you'll see here on the server is that we have this environment folder. And there's a lot of stuff that's going on in FSG, and you don't have to necessarily know every piece of it when you start to work with it. But as you start to use it and do things like deployment and customize it, you'll learn a little bit more with every modification that you make. But there's no use just learning everything from the beginning. But one thing that we're going to have to know about is deployment, and we're going to have to know about our environment. If we look at this index, what really is going to be happening here is that there's a node environment variable. And if in fact it ends up getting set to production, so here we're basically saying, hey, look, there's two different paths. There's a path to development.js in this directory that we're in. There's a path to production.js in this directory that we're in. And we look at this node environment. This doesn't need to be set up by us because this is automatically set up in your Heroku environment. This environment variable is automatically set to this value of production. So when we end up deploying to Heroku, we're going to find that it's going to end up using this file, which is different than, you might have even wondered at this point, you know, how do we know what database to connect to? And in development, we're using this file, which again just has our local database URI, our session secret. Again, this is for stuff that's just local, so it's not really all that critical. And let's see if we're done installing. Looks like we are. So at this point, I'm going to seed my database, make sure Mongo is running. Doesn't look like it is, so Mongo D. Now we have Mongo running. Let's go back here and try this again. Node seed should end up seeding some data for us. And so we should have some collections in our database. And at this point, we can actually start our application. But let's actually just take a look and look at our package JSON file. So when we go to start, right, we're going to use nodemon. We're going to end up watching for the server. We could do that. That's fine. The other thing that we could also end up doing here, if we do that and we say npm start, we'll find out that this won't quite do the job. And so we look at this. And we open this guy up. So here we've got our application, which is running. And let's just take a quick look, because one of the things that we know about here, in fact, so we have this public directory that has our JavaScript file. So actually what I was thinking was that wouldn't have been created, but the reason why it is created is that we have this post install that specifies that, so when we end up doing npm install, after we end up installing, we end up running our gulp build task. And our gulp, one of the things our gulp build task does is that it ends up taking all of our files that are in our JS folder, all of our SAS files as well, and it creates these two files, and that's what our application is going to end up using. So if we end up doing this and we want to go and deploy to Heroku, there's a couple of things that we're gonna have to do. One of them being that if we're in production, we're not going to run nodemon, right? There's no files to end up watching. So I'm going to modify this. I'm going to change this to start dev. And in my start, it's a little bit simpler in production. I'm simply going to say server start JS, right? So this should end up just starting our server, node, server start JS. And so if I were to say, let me kill this, I'll say npm start. We should be started, and that's what we expect to happen in production. So it's important to note that when we end up deploying this, automatically, after we deploy, after we end up pushing this to Heroku, Heroku will automatically look at our package JSON file and will want to get its dependencies, and it will call npm install. npm install will install all these dependencies that we have here, and then it will end up doing the post install, so it'll build our JavaScript files, and then it'll end up running npm start, so our server will end up starting. So let's actually set this up. I'm going to kill this for a second. So our goal here is to get this up on Heroku so we can take a look at it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a repo. So I'll say git init. And if I look at my status, right, a couple of things that you should end up seeing here is that you don't see your node modules folder. In fact, you don't see your public folder either. That's important as well. Again, we're not deploying that. That's going to get built dynamically with all of our assets, which is good. And what we'll do here is I'll say git.add, git.commit, my first commit. And right now, I'm not even actually going to create a repo on GitHub. This is just a local repository. But I do have my Heroku tool belt installed, and that's going to allow me to say Heroku create, and I'm going to create an app called nwind fsg. So here it's actually creating this. It'll go up and create this application for me. Let's actually look and just see that this is done. So all that tool does is remotely, it will end up using Heroku's API, and I've already logged into Heroku. That's the first thing you sort of have to do when you end up starting to use the Heroku command. But it has created the application. So now what I want it to do is I'm going to say git.push to Heroku, my master branch. Okay? So by default, I have my master branch. I'm going to push that master branch up to Heroku. So the command git.push, but I'm pushing to Heroku, and I'm pushing my master branch. So now it's going to go through the process. It's actually pushing all this stuff up to Heroku. We can see some of these things that it's going to do. It's got to install all these packages on Heroku. Might be a little bit slower the first time that it goes in there. But you're seeing it's going in and installing these modules. So once it ends up doing this, it's going to end up running that gulp build task, which is going to take care of our assets for us. It's going to end up taking care of our JavaScript files, and it's going to end up taking care of our CSS files for us. So here, you can actually see, if I scroll up here, it tells me that the build ended up succeeding, which means I was able to deploy it, but that doesn't mean it's going to run. These are all the things that it ended up loading. And if you go through here, you can see here's this post install. It sees, all right, I see there's a post install. It ends up doing this build. And here's all the things that ended up getting installed. And it says that it's launching, and it actually gives me a URL to go to. So first thing you're going to do is take this, and you're going to go over to a browser, and now you're not running this from your machine, but you're running it on Heroku. And it's not going to fare all that well. Eventually this will end up timing out. Actually, the first time it runs, it takes a little while for it to sort of start up. And even when you have a Heroku app that's no one's hit for a while, it sort of goes into a sleep mode. And there are things that you could do to make sure that that doesn't happen by, monitoring your application to sort of ping it every once in a while to keep it up, really. But let's take a look and see if there are some issues here. So if I go over here and I type in Heroku logs, and I could do this from Heroku as well, and here you can finally see it came back, gives me this application error. But if we end up looking at the Heroku logs, we're seeing that we're running into a problem here. And the problem that we're running into is that it's trying to make a connection to our MongoDB. And the issue that we have with it is we really don't have a connection string to our MongoDB. So the first thing that we really need to do is we need to set up Mongo on Heroku. Now, there might be a more direct way to do this, but this is what I've been doing for a while, is using something called Mongo Labs. And Mongo Labs allows me to create a database pretty easily. Let me log in here. And I'm going to create a new database. So they're calling this MongoDB deployments. It used to be called Mongo Labs. Now they call it MLab. And if I go over here and I say create new, what it should end up doing is giving me a screen to create a new database. So I'm going to do single node because I don't want to pay for it, and sandbox because it's free. And I'm going to call this nwind fsg-db. And I'm going to create a new Mongo deployment. So here's what the key is. The key is that MongoDB is going to give me a connection string to connect to the database. And in fact, there's going to be some sensitive information in there, because within that connection string, I don't want anyone to be able to sort of have a backdoor into this database. So I'm going to have to set up a username and password. And this is something that we also spoke about, is that we don't want that information to be exposed in our application. We don't want to have it on GitHub. Again, I have a public repo, but even if you have a private repo, that's not something you want to expose. So we're going to end up setting this up as an environment variable, and our app is set up for it already. Our app is going to look for this database URI. That's what it uses to connect to the database, which was empty before, and that's why I thought it was connecting locally, which it can't do. So I'm going to set up a key for Mongo Lab URI, and I'm going to set it up when this thing finishes loading, and I'm assuming that this is slow. Either there's something going on Mongo Labs, or I just have a really slow connection. So one of the things that I'm going to do here is it's going to force me to go in here. It's not forcing me, but it's saying, hey, look, there's nothing that's going to really help you here because you don't have a user. You actually have to create a user for this database. And so for my username, that's fine. I'll say Eric P. Katz, and I'm going to put in a password. So I'll get rid of this account in a second. So I don't want to keep this up here. But I'm just going to put in, let's see, I'll put in hello for my password. So I'm going to create this user. So I have to remember Eric P. Katz is the username, hello is the password. Now right up here, it's actually giving me the connection string. So we've used Mongo connection strings, but we've never had to put in a password. So here's the syntax for putting in a password. My username, my password, which is hello. And so if I go back over here, and I go back to my Heroku, and I go into FSG, and there are settings here. And these are where you end up putting your environment variables. And if I end up revealing these variables, this is going to be Mongo Lab URI. And just to be sure that I didn't misspell anything, I'll go back here, Mongo Lab URI, that looks right. And I'm copying and pasting what's in here, but they don't actually show my username and password. So this is going to be Eric P. Katz. And I'm going to make this hello. And I'll say add. Now, what this will automatically do, whenever an environment variable ends up changing, Heroku will restart your application. So if I was to go back here and reload this, okay, so now it's actually giving me a different error, right? So the error that I'm getting here is something that we probably have somewhere in FSG, because my app is actually running, and it's saying, hey, look, you need to have a secret option for your sessions. That's a requirement. Again, the idea here is that you don't want to put anything in here or in your file that's going to expose anything with your application. So here I'm going to go back to Heroku, and I'm going to add another environment variable. And I'll just, again, call it hello. And lo and behold, hopefully, if we reload this, we're going to end up getting a deployed application. Let's see, looks like we're spinning a little bit there. But again, this could just be my slow connection. So I don't know if that speed was something that had to do with Heroku or something to do with my collection, but you could see actually now I am deployed. Now, if I were to go back to my Mongo lab and reload this page, I should find that I have some collections because my application is using some sessions here. But you might wonder, how can you get some users up there to your account? Well, pretty simple thing you could do. If I end up taking this connection string, I'm not going to keep this up on my, I'm not going to end up committing this, but just to sort of get this working, one of the things you could do pretty easily is if I go to my development environment, I'll make sure I don't end up saving this. But I could go over here. And so this is my connection string to Mongo Labs, and this will just allow me to see the database pretty easily. So again, my password was hello, and my username was Eric P. Katz. And if I go over here to my command line, I could do node seed. And now it's actually going to be seeding this database remotely. So that's something else that you could end up doing when things end up getting deployed. Not as complicated as you think. So in fact, now I've got these two users here, and they were the users that were in our seed file. So I've got this testing user, and I've got this Obama at Gmail. And at this point, I could log in. Oh, I'm sorry, this is me running locally, which I'm not running at the moment. So I could go in here and I could say Obama at gmail.com, and that's set up with a password of POTUS. And now I'm actually logged in to my application. And probably if I were to go in and interrogate this sessions collection, I could probably find out a little bit more about how that's set up, although it's not really all that critical. So here's our database. Here's our collections, right? Here's our sessions, and there's one document in here, probably for the user that's currently logged in. So we're storing our session information, not in process. We're actually storing it through Mongo, and that's something else that you could end up taking a look at. So the key thing here is that when you're deploying, at least this application, and really in any application, there's environment variables that you need to set up that you don't want to really expose in your code base. So even though I'm showing you them here, I'll end up getting rid of them by making sure I delete this database. and even just delete this application. We could recreate it the next time I end up coming in here. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how the deployment ends up working. You know, a few different steps here. And again, you might be able to do this directly within Heroku, but doing it from the command line gives me some control that I can push it up without necessarily having to push it up to GitHub. I can do it directly from my local repository. All right, so that's about it. And we'll see you in another episode.